population, the people. The alternatives to be persuasive and intelligent have to be tangible. They can't just be doctrines, they can't just be ideas. There have to be concrete examples of what an alternative now looks like. And that's the experimentalist kind of these arrangements are made.
And it's disrupting the assumption that evolution means place state power or assertion of state power.
Well, evolution has no relation to the question of state versus non-state. So, and something that's not often understood is that this logic applies also to unitary states, not just to federal. So, a unitary state like the United Kingdom or France has a certain advantage over federation in the enactment of this idea. Because in a unitary state, there's no assumption that the different parts of the country have to have the same level of right of government.
Right. No, I've seen
So England can make, for example, an ad hoc deal with Scotland, which is different from the deal that it makes with Wales.
Right.
I don't think this is how.
No, that's interesting.
And then
There's a mic on it. Okay. So the mic is only for recording, it doesn't amplify your voice. We
Okay,
don't make a difference.
good.
Great.
Thank you.
This just became available soon.
Hey, how's it going? No. How's the new baby? Where I guess that. Oh my god.
It's his,
Wow. Is it nothing?
my uncle,
Okay, cool.
which is still like vomit fever.
Oh, got it.
Congestion.
Oh, terrible.
So far, it's okay. So far,
Yeah.
I've been tested.
That just happened, or?
Yeah. He's
Oh, got it. Oh, like now.
tested Sunday.
A lot.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, but he's growing well.
Good.
Pretty. Started moving around. Actually, moving around pretty well.
Very nice.
How you been?
Okay, yeah, I know, I was just talking to Tyron, it's like crazy, it's our last semester, and I'm like seeing all these people from 1L now, it's just like, feels so, are you gonna stay, are you going back to Texas, was it? Oh, cool. Back to New York. Yeah. No, I think I'm gonna do like something in public interest, but undecided, I just know I want to be in New York. So, we'll see. But, nice, are you gonna do a firm here? Or?
Yeah.
Cool. That's nice. Do you have a late load or late final load or?
That's I guess it's as light as it may get.
Okay.
But I'm taking classes I find interesting and they tend not to be
Great.
that easy. But if I don't care too much about
Yeah.
the grades, then everything becomes more pleasurable.
Exactly.
So that's kind of How about you? How about you? Are you doing?
Yeah, it's like not too bad. I'm in a bunch of seminars, so
Yeah, they come to exams.
yeah.
So it's probably different. Is the end of period still on?
No, actually.
They got off late.
As I noted, on Monday it ended Friday. Which I feel like was quicker than it's ever been. I don't know. I guess not, but
It's weird. Yeah, I only that one year. I think I did it. The head drop thing I think I did once, and then after that I'm like, I'm not doing this. It's just stressful.
well, and they do it so weird. That's why they have that like fire sale thing, but I guess like you can only add.
So I can't drop.
I guess not. Like I don't know. Because I was like, maybe I can find something there. There's like one class I don't love, and it's like I wonder if I can swap it, but.
What else are you taking?
Taking media and the law, just so
Yes, community eyes is the best.
I'm so sorry. Race and law, and
Do it while I down.
taking
Then I do.
the non-political economy, and then
So we're gonna begin in a
like
couple
public
of.
health policy. It's pretty good.
Let me remind you thinking about
How about you?
Psyched.
The earlier you begin to form ideas about the
Which is actually easier than thought, and then equity.
And what I would suggest to everyone is that you develop your idea of the seminar paper in the form of a propositional outline. So a propositional outline is not like a table of contents, a list of themes. It's a list of arguments. So it's the skeleton of a thesis. And that's what I would suggest as the most effective way of getting started. And then when you have such a propositional outline, or you have a provisional idea of your topic, come speak with me. So as I mentioned last time, I can easily be found in my office after I teach. So that's on Mondays and Thursdays at 11:30, and Tuesdays and Wednesdays at 3:45. So on any of those days, you can just come see me in my office, or you can write to me and send me first your propositional outline or your provisional idea of the theme of the seminar paper. The seminar paper, as I said last week, should be responsive to the agenda of the seminar. That doesn't mean it has to be the development of one of the themes that I've explicitly addressed in the seminar. But it should have some connection to what we're trying to do here. And one way of connecting, of course, is by criticizing or by proposing an alternative way of thinking. Are there any questions about the seminar papers or about the preparations for them? So just a couple of more minutes and we'll begin.
I've been out on East Coast for this. I just like this. I don't think. Yeah.
This is not or like any other case.
Yes, okay, so it's still a shot. Especially last weekend. Crazy, I was so excited.
Yeah.
It's
gonna be with my wife.
Yeah.
But that's like a few.
The most recent.
Okay, let's begin. So in today's meeting of the seminar, I want to proceed in 3 steps. In the first step, I want to return to the discussion last week of this conceptual toolbox for the transformation of contemporary legal thought. And I placed on the board there, on the right side of the board, a reminder of the structure of that toolbox. Then in the second step of the meeting today, I want to describe the genealogy of contemporary legal thought by highlighting how it differs from its 19th century precursor. And that's the main object of the chart that's on the board. And then in the third stage of the discussion, I want to present an argument which is intended to explain what is puzzling about the current practice of legal analysis. What is contradictory, what is disharmonious about it, to make its contradictions, as it were, explicit from within, to take its own perspective and to show you what is strange about it. So let's start with this idea of the toolbox. The motivation of this toolbox is very simple. The motivation is this. I don't think that the legal academics in these contemporary societies can reasonably be thought of as, let's say, the progressive legal academics, the progressive jurists, as a kind of political party or social movement. There's no reason to suppose that they would have this coherence. Particular jurists, as political activists or political prophets, can take a certain programmatic position. But the progressive movement as a whole in legal thought could not be reasonably expected to represent the profile of such a proto-political party. So there's another objective, which is more modest and more ample. And that is to create a space for a discussion, for a public conversation about the future of the country, of this country and of the advanced societies in general, that's different from the established discourse. Now, in order to understand what is characteristic of the established discourse, we have to go back to the idea that the last great moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the advanced societies was the social liberal or social democratic settlement of the last century. It was defined especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, but it was presaged by developments and debates before the war. And what is the dominant characteristic of this settlement? The dominant characteristic is that there was a renunciation, there was an abandonment of the attempt to rethink and reshape the institutional form of the state and of the economy. There was a retreat. So the institutional form of the market order was broadly accepted, and as well the institutional form of democratic politics. But in return, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to compensate for inequalities generated in the market order by using retrospective or corrective redistribution through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending or social entitlements, and to manage the economy countercyclically through fiscal and monetary policy. That's the social democratic or social liberal settlement, the regulated social market economy. And rather than opening up into a horizon of wider institutional debates, the dominant tendency has been to narrow the funnel even more. So the dominant project now in the rich North Atlantic countries is to combine the economic flexibility of the United States with the social protection of European social democracy within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements. Now, the claim I would make in our arguments is that none of the structural problems of the contemporary societies can be adequately solved or even addressed within the limits of the established institutional arrangements. For example, the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, which has been aggravated in recent decades. So what used to be the most advanced form of production, industrial mass production, which we call Fordist mass production, is in crisis, it has declined, and a new productive vanguard has emerged, which we call the knowledge economy. And this productive vanguard is multi-sectoral. It exists in every sector of the advanced economies, but in each sector it is a socially exclusive fringe that excludes the vast majority of workers and of firms. So a small part of the population is in the vanguard, the new productive vanguard, and everyone else is consigned to what you could call some form of make work, is in the long tail of the relatively backward firms or parts of the production system. So that's an example of a structural problem. And my underlying claim, the claim that motivates this toolbox and this concern, is the belief that structural problems require structural solutions. And by structural, I mean in the first instance, institutional. The institutional arrangements and the ideological assumptions associated with the institutional arrangements. So how can we reimagine the basic categories of contemporary legal thought so that they provide us some of the tools that we would require to open this space in which we would develop institutional alternatives? Now, to develop institutional alternatives, we encounter right at the outset a difficulty, an intellectual difficulty, and a difficulty that you can only understand when you appreciate the dominant trajectory of modern social theory, and especially the immense influence that Marxism has had on the progressives and on the left. So the dominant idea is that an institutional regime is a system, an indivisible system. Marx called it capitalism, but it can go under different labels. And a system is, by its nature, indivisible. So you either manage the system, that's conservative reformism, humanizing reformism, or you replace the system by another system. So an important practical consequence of the thesis of the indivisibility of regimes is this binary idea of politics. Now, I think that it's very clear that this binary idea is false, and that the characteristic form of structural change in the world is fragmentary. The idea of the total substitution of one regime by another is a limiting case, which for the most part is a fantasy. And the practical significance of the limiting case today is that it has been turned upside down. and become a pretext for its opposite. So the way that a Marxist might think is real change would be this substitution of one system for another. Real change is not possible. If it were possible, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the world through compensatory or corrective redistribution, for example. And again, the underlying claim here is that none of the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies can be effectively solved or even addressed, even imagined, unless we reopen the terms of the social democratic or social liberal compromise of the past century and explore the possibility of institutional changes that are structural without being systemic. And so that's what motivates then this idea of the toolbox. So what are some of the crucial legal categories or this is obviously an incomplete list, an open list that I put here on the board. And I just want to remind you of some of the elements. So first, private law. I begin with private law. And because one of the characteristics of the social democratic or social liberal settlement, one of its legal characteristics, is that it left private law largely unchanged. So what it did was create a new body of public law, the public law of the regulatory and redistributive state. And it superimposed this new body of public law on a largely untransformed body of private law. That's what happened. And one of the ways in which we might want to reopen the terms of the institutional debate is to consider the basic conditions, the legal conditions, the legal terms of economic decentralization, the property regime and the contract regime. So the background to this idea is that there are three things you can do with the market order. You can regulate it. And in a sense, every way of regulating it is conceptually the initial step in a way of reorganizing. You can redistribute its outcomes, the economic outcomes, to correct the inequalities that it generates. But there's a third thing you can do, and the third thing you can do is by far the most important. You can change it. You can change its legal and institutional architecture. But to do that, you need to change private law, the terms of economic decentralization. So that's then this idea. So we begin with property. So the classic 19th century idea of property is a unified right. All of its faculties are bound together and vested in the same right holder, the owner. That's the unified or consolidated property idea. But in most moments in the history of law, and in most legal traditions throughout world history, this has not been the normal form of property. Property has been disaggregated. There have been derivatives or fragmentary forms of the property right. And those fragmentary forms have been vested in different right holders who have simultaneous claims on the same productive resources. Let's just have a historical idea of this. Feudalism, for example, is a characteristic form, feudalism in Western history, European history, of this disaggregation of the property right. And the disaggregation of the property right reappears in many different settings in contemporary law, which we don't even think of when we think of disaggregation of property. For example, financial markets, capital markets, are based on the disaggregation of the property right. So-called financial derivatives are technically called derivatives because they are derivatives of the unified property right. That's what an option contract is. It's a partial property right. So property is a bundle, and the bundle is disassembled, and the component powers of use, usufruct, control of the income stream, and the right to alienate are then vested in different right holders. So this might be very important in reconceiving a market economy, because there would be many circumstances in which we might want different tiers of right holders, local communities, workers, local governments, to have claims on productive resources that were not total or absolute, but that were specific. For example, for the government to be able to work to lift up the backward periphery of the economy. So then in contemporary private law, the unified property right is the dominant paradigm. But this paradigm is already surrounded by a dense penumbra of anomalies, of exceptions. And what we imagine is to say, it will be dethroned, the unified property right, from the central position. And we'll imagine that there'll be a whole spectrum of forms of property. This goes to the essence of the market idea, because there is a contradiction in the market idea. As I think I mentioned last week, even at the most abstract level, there are two dimensions in the idea of a market economy. One dimension is the absolute level of decentralization, the number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the other dimension is the degree or the absoluteness of the control that each of those economic agents has over the resources at his disposal. Now, the conventional way of thinking is that these two dimensions go together. But they don't go together. And in fact, they contradict each other. So you could say that one way to increase the absolute level of economic decentralization would be to diminish or to relativize the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. So the claims on capital would then be temporary or conditional, rather than perpetual and absolute. Now let me give you a thought experiment just to suggest the meaning of this idea. Imagine a system in which all the fundamental productive resources of society are held in public trust. And anyone can use those resources to produce by assuring the trust of the highest rate of return. So there's like a permanent auction of the productive resources of society. And you get to use those productive resources temporarily and conditionally in this ongoing capital auction. Now, is that a market economy? I think it's very clear that it is a market economy, but it is a market economy constituted on a completely different architectural basis. So this is the significance, that the reshaping of the idea of the market order, in order to be radical, has to go to the basic terms of decentralized access to the means of production. And that's what we have in the property regime. Now, the other instrument in private law is contract. So A similar situation prevails in the private law of contract. There is a dominant paradigm. The dominant paradigm is the bilateral executory promise. Arm's length, completely articulated bargain for an exchange of performances at some moment in the future. And the contract is completely exhausted in that instantaneous moment, in that exchange of performances. Now you could say, that in fact is not the normal form of contract in social and economic life, even in the existing societies. The normal form of contract is an ongoing relational contract that is incompletely articulated or bargained out. And we have many examples of this in contemporary economic life. In the collaboration, the cooperation among enterprises, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, in the development of vaccines, to take a topical example. So again, we would relativize that absolute form of contract, and we would say there'll be a whole range of forms of contractual arrangements. And with this new conception of property and this new conception of contract, we would begin to redesign the basic legal architecture of the market order. So that's the idea there of that first set of categories. Then we come to administrative and social law. So here the basic conception is we need to change the way we think about the rule of law, the way that the state acts in administrative action. And that change in the way we think of public administration is related dialectically to a change in the way we think of the legal organization of civil society outside the market and outside the economy. So the conventional conception of the legal order is the state either does everything at once through universal rules or it doesn't do anything. The state has no way of experimenting, of trying something out in one place or with respect to one category of agents before it universalizes the solution. And we say the state has to be experimental. Now, what's the other side of that? The other side of that is that the state be able then, through this experimental organization, to cooperate. And I give two examples there of the way in which the state could partner with economic or social agents. So one way in which the state could partner is the state could partner with the backward firms or the precariously employed individual economic agents who are part of the vast economic periphery. So I said the vanguard is now an insular vanguard. Most people are condemned to some kind of make work. How will they be lifted up? Now we have historical examples of this in the United States. And one very striking example is the organization of family-scale agriculture in the first half of the 19th century. The Americans distributed the public lands, and they organized a system of agricultural extension that put advanced practice and science at the disposal of the family farmer. We would call this today a decentralized strategic partnership between the government and the family farmer. And at the same time, the family farmers organize among themselves what in today's vocabulary we would call a system of cooperative competition. That is, they pool certain resources, including their own labor, in order to achieve economies of scale while remaining independent proprietors and entrepreneurs. So then the Americans created the most efficient form of family-scale entrepreneurial agriculture that had ever existed in the world. When they did that, they were not regulating the agricultural market. They were creating a kind of market that had never existed before. And now we can imagine that there would be an industrial equivalent to that system of agricultural extension. The government would help lift up this economic periphery. That's what I mean by partnership in that context. Now, the other, yes?
What's an example of it these days? Who do you consider are in the peripheral right now?
Almost everyone. So there's you know, the productive vanguard of the knowledge economy are not just the platform oligopolies that are what we immediately think of when we think of the knowledge economy. The productive vanguard exists in every sector, intellectually dense services, and in a sense, high technology manufacture consists in combined and crystallized intellectual services. Many of the businesses in this high-tech vanguard are in fact called fabless. They have no physical factories. Their essential property is all intangible. It's intangible intellectual property. And on that basis, they manage this vanguard. So the in all of these contemporary economies, the vast majority of firms are relatively backward, especially, so first of all, the traditional mass production industries, like the Rust Belt in the United States, but also the vast majority of small and medium-sized firms. And increasingly in these societies, a larger part of the labor force has lost stable connections to any productive enterprise, to any business organization. So they're independent economic agents. For example, a nurse practitioner or a machine repair person. And so the objective would be to bring part of this economic periphery, which is the vast majority of the economy, closer to the vanguard. And not just the businesses, but these economic agents, like in the examples I gave, to transform these independent economic agents who have an only tenuous connection to business organization into technologically equipped artisans. So that's the context that I'm imagining. It's a lift-up operation, enhancing the quality of the productive apparatus. Yes?
Yes, and like, I guess, obviously this is theoretical, but is there an impetus for this? And is that impetus that most people are part of the rear guard, but then I guess also is the vanguard actively working to undermine this shift?
Of course.
Or why hasn't it?
So there are two
happened?
motives. There are two motives, right?
Right.
One is that this insularity of the productive vanguard is a fundamental cause of economic stagnation. So you know, in the United States now, there is a discourse that goes under the label of secular stagnation, which attempts to confer a halo of naturalness on the economic slowdown. And they say, for example, that an explanation of the economic slowdown, the slowdown in the rise of productivity in these economies, is that the technological innovations of today are much less transformative than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. That doesn't make any sense, because what could be more revolutionary, for example, than artificial intelligence? The problem is that the most advanced productive practice and technology is denied to the vast majority of economic agents. The second motive is the motive of inequality. So the inequalities in this kind of economy are rooted in its structural realities, in this vast abyss, in this chasm that separates the vanguard from the rear guard. And if the inequality becomes too great, if it increases beyond a certain point, it cannot be corrected by retrospective redistribution, the instrument of social democracy, because the redistribution would have to be massive. And long before it reached the requisite dimension to address the inequalities, it would have begun to undermine the established economic arrangements and incentives, and to exact an unacceptable cost in lost economic output. So I think those are the fundamental reasons that might lead you to think that there's this motivation. So how does it appear in politics? It appears because with this change in the nature of the productive vanguard, the whole middle part of the job structure has sunk and begun to dissolve. And the white working class majority of the country believes itself to have been abandoned and dispossessed. And I think it believes that correctly, to my mind. And so it has vast consequences. So then there's right-wing populism. It comes into this vacuum of the absence of an inclusive productivism. It requires a structural response. And so the private law part of this toolbox and the combination of the experimental character of state action with this ability to partner is about that. It's imagining some of the legal instruments by which we would address that reality. Now, the other example has to do with the provision of public services. And there I'm thinking outside the market of independent civil society. So the basic idea is the state provides a universal minimum to all of the citizens of public services. And that's the floor. And you could say the state might also operate at the ceiling in developing the costliest and most complicated services. But in this broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state engages independent civil society to partner with it in the experimental, not-for-profit provision of public services. So that's another idea of partnering, in which the experimental character of the state is the reverse side of the self-organization of civil society, which is able then to intervene or to participate with the state in the provision of public services. Now then we come to the third element in the toolbox. The third element in the toolbox is labor, the relation between labor and capital. And there's a short-term problem and a long-term problem. So the short-term problem is that an increasing part of the labor force is condemned to conditions of precarious employment. It is in temporary labor contracts, insecure labor contracts. Unionization has shrunk dramatically in all of these societies, not just in the United States. And so the official labor discourse is a discourse which serves the interests of the organized minority of the workers, but not the interests of the disorganized majority condemned to precarious employment. So the short-term problem is to master that reality. And by organizing and representing these disorganized workers, and to the extent that they're not represented and organized, through direct legal intervention in the employment relation. An example would be a principle of price neutrality, that precarious workers have to be remunerated at a level comparable to the level of similar work performed under conditions of stable employment. So we can distinguish legitimate flexibility from the illegitimate and dangerous cheapening and insecurity of labor. So I'm saying that's a short-term problem. And we can't have 20th century solutions of collective bargaining for a 21st century reality of this precarious employment and radical economic insecurity. But then I'm imagining there the long-term problem. The long-term problem is, what is the nature of free work in these economies? So the 19th century liberals and socialists all thought that economically dependent wage labor was a defective and inferior form of free work, retaining some of the characteristics of slavery and serfdom. And it would have to give way over time to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. So this wasn't just a Marxist thesis. This is what John Stuart Mill believed. This is what Abraham Lincoln believed. This is what he says in his address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society. No reasonable free man would consent to be a wage laborer for someone else. And that's an inferior form of free work. But the liberals and socialists of the 19th century were never able to solve the problem of how the supremacy of self-employment and cooperation could be reconciled with the draconian imperative of economies of scale, the aggregation of resources at scale in a modern, complex economy. To do that, we have to combine these innovations in the labor regime with the reinvention of the market order, back to the problem of property. And the final chapter in this toolbox there has to do with the constitutional arrangements of representative democracy. So the thesis is that all the democracies that exist in the world are relatively weak democracies. All of them make change continue to depend on crisis. So the rule in these democracies is, if there's no crisis, there's no change. Crisis, and the extreme forms of crisis are economic ruin or military conflict, war. Now, how could we create a high-energy democracy that diminishes the dependence of change on crisis, so that the impulse to structural transformation becomes endogenous, rather than depending on these external events? And there are the elements then of this. What are the elements of a high-energy democracy? So the first element is raising the temperature of politics, meaning the level of organized popular engagement in political life. The central thesis of conservative statecraft and conservative political science is that politics is either institutional and cold, or hot and anti-institutional. But it can't be hot and institutional at the same time. What I mean by calling it hot is the level of organized popular engagement in political life. So at the end of the day, you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. That's the conservative idea. And it excludes the possibility that you could raise the temperature of politics through institutional means and have a politics that is both hot and institutional. And you could say a politics which is fertile in structural alternatives is unavoidably a hot politics, a politics premised on a high level of political mobilization. Then the second element has to do with the pace of politics. So how do you accelerate the supersession of impasse when there's a deadlock that paralyzes politics? So that's the American constitutional architecture. There's a liberal principle of fragmentation of power, and there's a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And the Americans think that these two are inseparable. But they're not inseparable, they're connected by intention. You could easily imagine constitutional mechanisms that would rapidly resolve impasse. For example, you could say, if there is an impasse, either of the political branches could call early elections to resolve the impasse. But the elections would always be bilateral for both branches. So the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And by this simple device, you could transform the presidential regime into a motor for the acceleration of politics. So a high energy politics is a high temperature politics and an accelerated politics, which wants to resolve impasse quickly by engaging the general electorate, the citizenry, in the resolution of the impasse. The third principle is the principle of combining strong central initiative with devolution. So, as a country goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets by allowing part of itself to diverge from the predominant solutions and to create counter models of the national future. And federalism is an instrument for this. So you could say first the cooperative federalism, but then there could be another stage in which parts of a country can apply for rights of very wide divergence from the dominant solutions. Of course, they could be an instrument of abuse. They could entrench the privileges of a certain group or attack the rights of other groups. So this has to be controlled politically and judicially by developing a jurisprudence that would contain this, so that there would be no abuse of devolution. And finally, enhancing representative democracy with instruments of direct democracy. So this direct or participatory democracy. So the radicals of the 19th century imagined that the constitutional forms, the dominant constitutional forms, could be replaced by a government of popular councils, or Soviets, and it was impossible. On every occasion, the popular conciliar form of democracy turned out to be a momentary interlude, which rapidly devolved into its opposite, some form of autocracy. So representative democracy is necessary, but it can gradually acquire some of the traits of direct or participatory democracy. Locally, through participation in local government, or centrally, through plebiscites and referendums, for example. Now, as I said, this is just an open list, but the open list has a function. The function is to imagine how would we use the resources of law and legal thought to open up this intellectual space of institutional alternatives, which the social democratic or social liberal settlement of the past century closed down. And so then, this is not a particular political program or project, It's simply the creation of a set of legal categories which are in the service of this broader idea of social possibility. That's how I was thinking of it. Now, would someone like to speak to this? Either to the general idea of the toolbox or to some particular feature of it? Yes,
Sorry, I have a number of clarifying questions.
yes.
First, I was quite confused about the experimental form of administrative action.
4 months,
Administrative action.
yes.
So would you mind just,
Yeah, so the idea is, our conception of the rule of law is, the rule of law means the state acts universally through general rules. And it either commits to general rules, solutions for everyone, for large classes, or it doesn't act. It can't act experimentally. This is a vast restraint. Because how can we know what to do unless we can try things out?
isn't this sort of the basis of the Federalist system?
Well, federalism can be an instrument of experimentalism, but it's just one example. So there's of course a contradiction, because in the United States, the Federalist system from the beginning was imagined as experimental. The Federalist Papers say that the states are laboratories of experimentation and so forth, but in fact, the rigid allocation of powers within a conventional federation is anti-experimental. So there has to be vertical cooperation among the 3 levels of the federation, and horizontal cooperation among the states and the municipalities. So cooperative federalism is, as it were, the first stage of the experimental uses of the federal system. But federalism is not the only example of experimentalism. So that's a much broader conception. The state should be able to experiment. We shouldn't think that law involves a universalistic, irreversible commitment to general solutions. The state has to be able to try things out. Now, then think of the administrative agencies created by the New Deal. If we begin to think that the role of these agencies is not simply to be a transmission belt between the general laws and the particular problems, but that they would be agents of experimentation, obviously they would have to be staffed and controlled in a different way. We would have to think of them not as the seat of technocracy, of a technocracy of public policy, but as the representatives of the real social forces. So this change in the form of administrative action has consequences, has implications for the composition of these bodies, as in this example of the administrative agencies. Yes.
When you were discussing private law, and I was just thinking of alternatives we may have right now, would you consider the co-op model, both in terms of living, but also some businesses, like I know grocers sometimes are co-op models, is that a potential existing alternative model that could be added to it? And if so, is there reasons why it's not more popular? Perhaps it's not incentivized during the current architecture. People just don't like giving up their rights and living in a co-op in large numbers.
Well, it depends, because a cooperative form of organization, for example, worker ownership of an enterprise, if it is simply within a system that is organized on different principles, may have very little transformative significance. So the Yugoslav system of self-management came to grief on this. Because suppose you have a system of worker ownership and worker management. Now, then some of the enterprises will flourish, others will fail. Do the ones that flourish have the ability to buy out the other ones? And can they then begin to introduce a division, a dualism between worker owners and worker non-owners? So you have then two categories. So this is the kind of problem that arises when you try to resolve things by incorporating into the existing form of the market order a contrary principle. These examples of property and contract are not about that. They're about how you think of the market order as a whole and how you then, you change your conception of the basic terms of decentralized access to the means of production. Now, as I say, this is not a particular program. I deliberately didn't, I'm all in favor of particular programs and having a particular institutional program. But I'm trying to imagine a different vocation, a different role for the jurists, in which they're not in their collective capacity subscribing to a particular program. They're opening up this space of institutional alternatives and institutional debates, which the compromises of the past century closed down. That's the idea. Yes?
Under constitutional law, I didn't really fully understand what radical devolution meant in terms of like.
Radical devolution means devolution is a reference to this devolving power from central government to parts of the country. In a federal system, those would be the states and towns. In a unitary state, like the United Kingdom of France, they would be local government. And the general belief is that a unitary state has less potential for devolution than a federal system. I think that's a mistake, because one of the advantages that a unitary state has over a federation is that in a unitary state there's no presumption that all the parts of the country must enjoy simultaneously the same level of right of devolution. So for example, as I was just saying before we began the class, England can make a deal with Scotland. The United Kingdom can make a deal with Scotland different from the deal that it makes with Wales. So there can be an ad hoc deal with different parts of the country in a unitary state. And that in a certain way facilitates this combination of strong central initiative with devolution. So what's the basic motive of devolution? The basic motive is the one I cited. As a country goes down a certain road, it should be able to hedge its bets by allowing parts of itself to create tangible alternative models of the national future. It says, you decided to go down this road, but now let me give you an example of what a different national future would look like. That's the role of devolution. Now, why is this so important to us? And let me now try to explain it in general terms. The liberals and socialists of the 19th century recognized the primacy of structural alternatives over non-structural alternatives. But they were all committed to institutional dogmas. So each faction of the progressives, the classical liberals, the socialists, had their institutional prescription, a formula, a blueprint. Now, what is our situation? Our situation is that we have, like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reasons to recognize the primacy of structural solutions. As I said, structural solutions to structural problems. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we also have reason to distrust institutional dogmas, fixed institutional blueprints. And therefore, we confront a problem that has no historical precedent, which is, how can we recognize and affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism? That's the problem we have to solve. And it's a problem that we have to solve by a series of forms of experimentalism. And these dogmatic ideas that it's a system, that it's indivisible, what I call the binary idea of politics, contradict the imperative of experimentalism. Because for us to be able to experiment, we have to be able to undertake these structural transformations in a fragmentary, piecemeal, but nevertheless cumulative fashion. Yes?
I guess one question I have about all the ideas is that it seems like there's a need to build in an answer to how the powers and wealth that currently exist and benefit from the status quo and are actively working against some of those experimental alternatives can be overcome. So like, for example, I think the modern Democratic Party today has that sort of hot institutional vision. Like, and I think of an example of this organization called Run for Something, which has partnered, I think, 100,000 or 200,000 young people and told them, just, here's your local office that has nobody there, you should run for school board, you should run for a local judge, you should do this. And I think that's consistent with the idea you're articulating, but that's just such a little piece of a puzzle that's insurmountable against, disinformation or lack of resources or all of those things. So I guess I just wonder do you think each of these ideas needs to answer that question or not?
How do we think about the social base or the social constituency of these programmatic alternatives? What's the relation between our thinking about their institutional content and our thinking about the real social forces that might support them? Now, unfortunately or fortunately, this is a question that also requires theoretical elucidation. And so, let me contrast the view that I want to defend to the Marxist view. Again, so the Marxist view is that class interests have an objective content. The objective content is determined by the position each class occupies in what Marx called the mode of production. So the position of each class in the social division of labor and its relation then to what might come next in the next system. And the broader in scope and the greater in intensity class conflict becomes, the more obvious, the more perspicuous the objective content of class interest becomes. And the price of making a mistake about what the objective content of the class interest is defeat. So history teaches you differently. Now, I think that's the exact opposite of the truth. So what I think is that as conflict increases, the apparent objectivity of class interest begins to dissolve. And the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives? And who would I become? And what would my interests be under these alternatives? Now, let me then develop this argument then to the next stage. So, take what may be the single most important example of this problem that you raise. The single most important example for the left parties, for the progressive forces. Their historical constituency was the organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy. So the organized labor force in the mass production industry, that was the core constituency of the left parties. Now, then the question arises, what is their interest when the system of mass production, as in the American Rust Belt, comes under pressure? And then there is, again, contrary to the Marxist thesis, there is a systematic duality in the way of defining and defending their interests. Because one view is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive. So it says, the interest of this labor force is to build itself into this niche that it occupies in the present social division of labor, and to defend it against all comers. So to defend it against the groups that are closest to it in the surrounding social space. So that would be the small business, the foreign workers, the temporary workers, and so forth. So they say, what is our political project? Our political project is to buy a few more years for declining mass production industry. The alternative way of defining and defending your group interests is for them is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So they say this project here of getting a few more years for mass production industry has no future. This is something that isn't going to come back. This is a ship that's sinking. So we have to convert this declining mass production industry into something else, into a form of the knowledge economy. And in that project of industrial conversion, the groups that we used to think of as our adversaries will have to become our allies. The small business class, which is also part of the periphery, the unstable temporary workers to which parts of industrial production are subcontracted, and so forth. So the idea about the alternatives is the reverse side of a conception of social alliances. That's the secret. And so but of course then there's what the economists would call a principal agent problem. Because the leaders of the left parties and the leaders of the union movement say, you want me to abandon my traditional base and its defense before I have another base, and I'll be left with nothing. Because their horizon is a biographical horizon, and they don't think historically. And somehow we have to take the other position. Say, this project of trying to perpetuate the dominant form of production has no future. We have to think of another project. That other project has to be articulated in legal institutional terms. And that's the object of this toolbox. But I think that you're entirely correct that the question of conceiving the alternatives is inseparable from the question of understanding the interests and the real social forces. And each of these questions is, as it were, the reverse side of the other.
But so is an example of what
Yes.
you're saying, like I think Democrats have tried to do, for example, saying coal is dead. This is a new demographic that we're trying to reach. Coal jobs, we're going to eliminate those. We're going to retrain you for this green economy. Is that an example of what you're saying, or is that doubling down on something that's sort of not worthwhile and just kind of trying to hold on to?
Well, that's, as it were, an extreme example, because instead of simply abandoning that factory, you can try and change it, right? So a traditional automobile industry can be turned into a part of the knowledge economy. And that's what some of them are trying to do now. And the interest of the workers is to be part of that process. But in order to sustain that process politically, they have to operate as allies of the groups that they used to think of as their adversaries. So I think that's the problem. Huh? And it is incompatible, of course, with the short-termism of a large part of the leadership of the union movement and of the political forces. But the weight of the short-termism is shaped also by their ideas of what's possible as an alternative. Yes?
I was gonna ask, it seems like some of these pieces of the toolbox can run into, or at least run into some difficulties if other parts aren't changed. So for example, taking the question of changes in, you know, labor relations or the move, like my friend over is suggesting, well, if that doesn't happen and people are still thinking in short-term solutions and in this way of like protecting what's existing, a move to, for example, a hotter democracy might enable those entities to kind of entrench those interests.
Yes.
And in ways like, for example, you know, to lash out against populations that they feel are their competition, whether they're migrant workers or some other part of it. So it feels like moves to in one part of it, unless you address other parts, might run.
Correct.
Like,
Correct.
Yeah.
So we could apply to this Trotsky's category of combined and uneven development, right? So you say this isn't a system, the way the Marxists think of this mode of production. But it is true, as you say, that different parts impinge on one another. So the experience of structural change is that where do you begin? You begin where you can begin. So the initial steps are always just circumstantial. And then you advance on a certain front until you hit against limits which are imposed by the failure to advance on other fronts. Then you have to turn to those other fronts. So it's not as if the parts of this reality had no relation to each other. But they can't adequately be described in this language of systemic change, but rather in this form of this combined and uneven development in which the different parts are related, but they're not related as the different elements of an indivisible package or system. So I think that's the general principle. And I would say that in this reality that I'm describing, what do I take to be the most fundamental elements? The most fundamental elements are the system of production and the insular character of the new Vanguardism. I think that's fundamental. That there's a change in the political economy, and that the most advanced productive practice is now this socially exclusive fringe. That has vast consequences for every part of society. So that's one thing that I would take as fundamental. The other thing that I would take as fundamental is politics. And the transformative potential of democracy. So, to what extent is political life, democratic politics, organized to generate structural alternatives, to weaken the rule of the living by the dead, and to diminish the dependence of change on crisis? That's also fundamental. So, I would say it's the character of political life and the character of political economy. But we are getting into a terrain which is already like the definition of a particular project. And when I'm thinking of this toolbox, as I said, in a broader space, in which, and the justification of the broader space arises from a conception of what law is. So, law is the institutional form of the life of a people. represented in relation to the understandings of ideals and of interest that make sense of it. That's what law is. So the comparative advantage of law and of legal thought is that it presents the institutional life of the people in detailed form. So not as an abstraction, like the market economy or capitalism, but in the reality in which it becomes obvious that we can't think of it as a system. That's the comparative advantage of law. And what I would say is that this ascendant form of legal thought squanders the comparative advantage of law, which is precisely this institutional particularity and this faculty of transformation. That's what I'm suggesting. But of course, then there's always the problem of the agent. So who is going to do this, right? Because, law is studied in the law schools. The law schools are peopled by individuals who are thinking of they're going to have a technical legal profession, courts and representation of private interests and so forth. What does that have to do with this? So there's a real question of agency. Who is going to do this? Huh? And what I would say is that for any important transformative task in the world, the agent who would execute it never exists, because the world is organized to reproduce itself. So the agent who would transform it never exists beforehand. The agent has to be created later. And typically because among the existing cast of agents who were there for the benefit of the reproduction of the world, some of them, for whatever reason, are disloyal or unfaithful or subversive. Otherwise, nothing would ever change in the world. Yes?
So let's say the social liberal established way of thinking is reopened. Let's say it's reopened in academia and in law schools. And I think we still have a problem that once it's reopened, when those broad categories that it's now trying to construct reach real issues that it's now proposing, such as, let's just say, nonprofits should not open taxed or not taxed at the same way. There should be different things. Bachelor's degrees should be 3 years and not 4 years.
Yes.
Political campaigns should be completely paid for by taxpayers and the government with strict limits. Property is thus challenged, the property rights are challenged. But challenged not just in the broad scheme of, we're going to redefine what property is, but also in actual programs that will then meet resistance. Or the same kind of thing would happen in other spheres as well.
Yes.
Military service and civilian service, everybody will serve, right? We want to build community, we will challenge your views of saying no in peacetime. Those kind of large, real world changes that take completely different structural ways to see for goals that could newly be enunciated, are going to run into real problems when they're really enunciated. And if we talk about devolution, would the state be able to try something that the Constitution would say, I'm not sure you can really do that? Could there really be a cooperative thing where these things could actually be experimentally tried on a smaller scale?
Well, but what's the point? What's the general point then? Because I'm not imagining that this apparatus here is like some, in and of itself, some engine of transformation of the world. There's the question that was raised here. What's the relation of this to the real social forces? But this is just focusing on the idea element. And the idea element is limited, but it's absolutely vital, because everyone is at the mercy of his ideas, right? So, like Franklin Roosevelt had these, said, I'm going to be a radical experimentalist. What the country demands is incessant experimentation. then you look at the content of the experimentation, and where did it come from? It came from the ideas that were available in the early 1930s. Corporatist restabilization of the economy, employment of idle labor by the government and so forth. So I'm trying to imagine here just the intellectual element of this transformation. I know that ideas by themselves can't change the world. But without ideas, we can't change the world. So this is the asymmetry in which we have to have some larger conception of possibility and some understanding of the alternatives before we can do anything. And I think that's the advantage of being here in this academic space. So this is not the moment to engage in these discussions about ad hoc political solutions, because that's not what we can do here. But if we're removed from the immediate political struggle in a particular country, what we can do is to develop thought. And without thought, we can't change anything. That's the simple proposition. I'm not idealizing this intellectual transformation as if it would be a deus ex machina that by itself would transform the world. I know it isn't. But I'm surrounded on every side by these forms of thought that deny possibility. So on one side, there's Marxism with this idea of systems and laws and so forth. And then the other side, there's the contemporary social science and policy discourse, which radically suppresses the imperative of structural vision.
I think that's certainly clear. I'm really just more worried about, given that all that is true, right? When it actually hits, the rubber hits the road, right? When you say, okay, we're going to take this new concept of property and we're going to challenge it, not just in that wonderful example you gave, we're going to have public property that can be used and bid on by different people.
Yeah, but you're skipping all the intermediate steps, because there's a huge distance between the development of these abstract categories and any real thing in any real society. So this is just the beginning of an intellectual trajectory in which we would start to reshape the understanding of what legal thought is for. I think that legal thought is to address the institutional details and the detailed institutional alternatives. Because as I said, that's its comparative advantage. But I understand that these conceptual tools by themselves are almost impotent. They have to be combined with all the other stuff. But we have to proceed part by part. Yes? No, okay. So maybe this is a moment for me I really hadn't intended to speak at such length about this toolbox, but it's an important element early in our discussions. So what I placed on the board here is a very simple genealogy of contemporary legal thought. And it has a purpose. It has a didactic purpose, which is to expose the family resemblance, so to speak, between 20th century legal thought and 19th century legal thought. So you have to understand what is the self-image of the contemporary conventional way of thinking about law. The self-image is it's engaged in a two-front war against two enemies. On one side is the bad old 19th century conceptualism. Law is a gapless system of rules. There's a deductive method of inference. The categories all guide us. in finding a single correct solution to every problem of legal choice and so forth. On the other side is the irresponsible view that legal analysis is simply the continuation of politics by other means. So this is the self-image of the established form of legal thought. And this chart that I placed on the board is, in essence, an attack on that self-image, exposing the affinity of 20th century legal thought to 19th century legal thought. So we start with the first column. The underlying institutional and ideological settlement. So in the 19th century, it's the idea of the market order, the free economy, against the background of a limited elitist form of democracy, what I call proto-democratic liberalism. Liberalism now in the European sense, not in the American sense. And then in the 20th century, it's this social liberal, social democratic compromise. The humanization of the market order in the vocabulary of social democracy and social liberalism. Now then the conception of law. So law in the 19th century project of 19th century legal science, a gapless system of rules. Now, and of categories of ideas. Now, I want to say something first by way of correcting the 20th century interpretation of the 19th century. So the 20th century interpretation is that they were mired in conceptualism and deductivism. The truth is very different. They had a typological idea. So the typological idea was that there are different types of society. And the content of the type, the institutional and legal content of the type, is predetermined. So a society by evolution or by choice can become a certain type of society, like free society. But it doesn't get to choose the content of that type. The package has a content. And the project of legal science then was to develop the inbuilt legal content of the type. Now what's interesting is that this idea of conservative legal science in the 19th century was essentially the same as the Marxist idea. Because what is Marxism? It has the same idea. The capitalist economy has a built-in structure. It has certain characteristics. All of its parts fit together. And once you're in capitalism, you have the rules and categories of capitalism. You don't get to choose. And so there's this conception of the categories and of the rules. Law is a gapless system of rules. Now, actually, 19th century jurisprudence subverted this idea instead of enacting it. So it started out with this notion. The type has a built-in legal content, and it ended up with the opposite. So what did the jurists discover in the 19th century? They discovered that if you start with these abstract ideas about freedom of contract and private property, and you proceed down to lower and lower levels of concreteness. For example, the question of the rights of owners upstream and downstream on a body of water, on a river. Rights of neighbors against one another. How do you resolve those conflicts? What the jurists discovered is that it was impossible to dispel those ambiguities by inferring back the answer from the abstract idea of the market rule. So Oliver Wendell Holmes, this was his idea, that at each stage down the ladder of concreteness, the resolution of the problem turned on some conflict of visions and of interest. And it could not be inferred from the abstraction. That was the central idea. So they start out with this typological idea and they undermine it. And now you come to the 20th century conception that law is not a gapless system of rules, it's an open system of rules and standards informed by policies and principles. Now come to the third column in this chart. What is the organizing contrast for 19th century legal thought? It's a contrast between two forms of law, good law and bad law. Good law is distributively neutral. It is the impersonal order of coordination. It has no distributive consequences. Bad law is redistributive. It arises from the capture of the state by factions of society, who then use the power to make law or to interpret law to distribute advantages to themselves. And there is an implication of this idea that remains alive in contemporary American legal thought, the state action doctrine, which is a central doctrine of constitutional law, distinguishing states of affairs in society in which the state is complicit from those for which it's not complicit. Now think about it. Does that make any sense? Is there anything in society, in the creation or reproduction of which the state and its politics are not complicit? So it's as if we could distinguish the states of affairs into those which are politically created and those which are somehow just naturally there. There's nothing that's naturally there. Everything is politically created or reshaped in some way. So the state action doctrine in constitutional law is a contemporary vestige of this 19th century contrast. Now, the 19th century contrast between distributively neutral law, the law of impersonal coordination, and bad redistributive politicized law is then replaced in the 20th century by another contrast, which is the contrast between two kinds of lawmaking. Law informed by policies responsive to the public interest and impersonal principles of right, and law just deals. So there's a conflict in the legislature between, for example, the import industries and the exporting industries, and the law is just a snapshot of the composition of interests, who won, who lost, how much they won or they lost. That's law's deals. Now, I think that this 20th century contrast is obviously a looser and more general version of the 19th century contrast. There's a clear affinity of family resemblance between these two contrasts. And then the practice of legal doctrine. The 19th century idea is there's quasi-deductive inference from the rules. In fact, there's a process of progressive determination of the abstraction. The abstract principles of freedom of contract and private property are rendered progressively more concrete. And then there's the 20th century conception of reasoned elaboration of law, purposive elaboration, in the vocabulary of principle and policy. So, how do you understand law? You understand it by attributing purpose to it. And in what vocabulary do you describe the purposes? You don't describe the purposes as the deals. Someone won and someone lost. You describe them as these principles of impersonal right, or these policies responsive to the public interest. So the chart suggests that in fact 20th century legal thought is not the opposite of 19th century legal thought. It's a loosening, it's a retreat to a more defensible position. The categories become vaguer and more general, but they seem to me to be not fundamentally different. Now let me stop there for a moment and ask whether you like to question, comment on this chart and its meaning before I move on. So, yes, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess I was going to ask, could you speak to the relationship between your, between this critique of the 20th century approach to interpreting the law and your institutional critique, and it's kind of institutional imagination?
Well, I think that so a simple answer to that is that this 20th century conception of legal thought is saying this is a system. Law is a system. And legal thought is a system. The system is described in the vocabulary of policies and principles. It's a system such as a single mind and a single will might have conceived. And one way of describing it is its regulated social market economy. It's this humanization of the market order. But it's not just a set of ad hoc transitory compromises emerging from conflict in society. It is a flawed approximation to an intelligible plan, an intelligible and defensible plan of social life. And so the market is the market is an instrument for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, it generates inequalities. And then we correct the inequalities that it generates after the fact through retrospective redistribution by progressive taxation and redistributed social spending. That's an example. So what we have in the world is this flawed approximation to a reasonable plan of social life. And the market order is this expanding pie. Now it has to be mastered and rationalized and humanized and so forth. I think that's the spirit of this 20th century project. And to my mind, it is denying us what is useful and interesting about law, which is this quality that when the institutions are represented at the requisite level of detail, it becomes manifest that they're not a system. And we have to understand that they're not a system in order to be able to change them. That's ultimately what's at stake here, I would say. Now, and that then leads me into really what I was thinking of as a third, yes?
One more question. So at the beginning of the segment, you said that the 20th century way of thought kind of lended itself to be used by politics by other means.
It lend itself to what?
It lend itself to be manipulated or used as politics by other means. But
no, I was saying that the 20th century jurists thought of themselves
Yeah.
as engaged in this two-front war.
Yeah, right.
And the second front of the two-front war was the idea that law is just a continuation of politics by other means. The interpretation of law is the continuation of this ideological struggle. There's no essential difference between making a law and interpreting it. So they saw themselves as opposed to that.
Opposing that, I see.
So that was the second mistake. The first mistake was pure conceptualism.
Sure.
It's just deduction from a gapless system of rules. The other is it's just politics. And their view of themselves is they occupy this reasonable middle position
Okay.
between the view that legal thought is just politics and the view that it's just deduction.
But in some ways, were people aware that potentially the 19th century gapless, like the law, was also politics by other means? It just happened to be that there's a political consensus that the law matched what they wanted it to be.
They thought of the 19th century jurists as the victims of a crude superstition. This crude conceptualist, mechanical, deductivist way of thinking about law, as opposed to their flexible, purposive, teleological, reasonable way of thinking about law. And so this is how they think of so it's a kind of centrism, which explains the spirit of this 20th century jurisprudence. Now, maybe I have enough time to now describe an argument which is intended to expose the contradictory character of legal thought, of this form of rational reconstruction of law, and to help us understand what's puzzling about it. So, and I want to do this on its own terms. That is, I want it to be an argument that explicates what's puzzling about law, taking its own position and viewing it from within. So it's a 5-step argument. The first step says, given any body of received legal understandings, for there to be reasoned elaboration about law, the interpretations of what the law means can't change suddenly or change in too many directions. There has to be an approximate consensus about the received meanings of the law. So imagine a traditional law class in which the students are given a bunch of cases and they're asked then to make sense of them in relation to some idea of purpose described by policy and principle. So what is the underlying apparatus of policy and principle that allows you to reconcile these cases? And the basic idea is there has to be some convergence of legal understandings of the received meaning of law for there to be legal thought at all. Now then, the second step of the argument is, if you're asked to reconcile those cases in relation to some underlying apparatus of policy and principle, you shouldn't be able to reconcile all of them. You have to be able to reject some of the received legal understandings as mistaken. So legal interpretation must enjoy what you could call a revisionary power. It must have the power to reject some understandings as mistaken. Because if you can't reject some understandings as mistaken, then all of your legal interpretation becomes suspect. In other words, it's an elastic rhetorical apparatus which you can manipulate after the fact to suit any understanding of law. That's no good. So you have to be able to justify most of the received understandings, but to reject some of them as mistaken. So those are the first two principles. Convergence, but not too much convergence. Convergence with a possibility of rejecting received understandings as mistaken. Now comes the third principle. How much revisionary power should legal thought enjoy? Should you expect there to be massive rejection of received understandings, or only occasional rejection? Where should you look for the source of the ideas that will determine the rejection? Now, the answers to these questions are all unclear. But you could say, as a practical matter, that in this way of thinking about law, what is expected is that there will be some revisionary power, but it won't be too much. In other words, most of the received legal understandings will be reconciled with one another and with the underlying policies and principles. Not all of them. So there will be, as it were, an additional quota to which the revisionary power will apply. That's the general expectation. Now, it's completely mysterious why you would expect that to be the case. Now I come to the fourth step of the argument. The fourth step of the argument says, the apparatus of ideas, in the name of which you reject some of the received understandings as mistaken, should not be just ad hoc attributions of purpose. They should be fragments of a coherent narrative. A narrative that can be described not as a series of ideals, but in this vocabulary of general principles and of right and policies responsive to the public interest. So, as you begin to work over a body of law and to explain it and justify it in the light of the underlying policies and principles, you develop these narratives. And the narratives have a coherent, theory-like character. They merge, they converge, they are tentative fragments of an intelligible and defensible plan of social life. That's the fourth step of the argument. And now you come to the fifth step of the argument. The fifth step of the argument is, on what basis would we be entitled to expect that the law would be informed by these theory-like conceptions that are fragments of an intelligible and defensible plan of social life? You have the two objections. So the first objection is, everything that we've learned about history suggests that there's no reason to expect that. This is like a right-wing Hegelian view of history. The real is rational. And Marxism bears the influence of this view. So there's a script. There's a script in history. And the script is manifest after the fact in these theory-like conceptions. the political agents who made the law were not conscious of the script. They were on its unwitting instruments. They thought that they were divided amongst themselves by radically different interests and visions. But in fact, they were the tools, they were the instruments of this logic. Now, we don't believe that. So we come to disbelieve in this idea that there's this script. So how can law after the fact, as it comes into the hands of the jurists, look so different from law before the fact as it emerges out of politics, conflicts of interest and conflicts of vision? On the other hand, and now this is the second objection, or the second side of the objection, suppose there were such a script, and suppose that it in fact animated the law, and that we could describe it retrospectively in this rational language of policy and principle. What would be the consequences for our ideal of democracy? So democracy is popular self-government, collective self-determination, determining the terms of social life. But if in fact the political agents are the instruments of their script, they're not free as they think they are. So the implication is to eviscerate, to hollow out the content of the idea of popular self-government, of democracy. So the idea of the script is literally unbelievable, given our contemporary view of historical experience. And if it were believable, it would undermine our notion of democracy. So then it turns out in this argument that the prospective genealogy of law, the creation of law out of conflicts of interest and vision, cannot be reconciled with the retrospective genealogy of law, in which law appears in the hands of the jurists as if it were a repository of principles and policies, rather than just an accidental series of conflicts between interests and between visions of different classes and groups in society. So this is what's strange about this form of rational reconstruction of law, that it's this mysterious alchemy by which the prospective genealogy of law, as a creation of conflicting interests of vision, is then transformed into this retrospective genealogy in which law emerges as organized by these coherent policies and principles. Where do they come from? And how could there be this mysterious transubstantiation in which the prospective genealogy becomes the retrospective genealogy? This is what is strange about this form of rational reconstruction of law. It seems, now you tell me what's the answer to this five-step argument? So there are two crucial moments in the argument. And think about this over the coming week. There are two crucial moments. One is this question of the level of revisionary power, the third step of the argument. And this fortunate happenstance that you are required by the legal materials to reject some of the received understandings, but not to reject too many of them. If you reject too few of them, there's a suspicion that the apparatus of legal interpretation is simply an elastic rhetorical medium. You're told to reconcile a bunch of cases, And you can reconcile everything. If you can reconcile everything, you can reconcile nothing. On the other hand, if the apparatus of policy in